So I think we're starting to let people in, but we'll take a couple of minutes. Talking about art, I love the art in Tricontinental. Oh my goodness, it's so beautiful.
It's what we call the battle of emotions, Medea, that you're just not only touching people in ideas, but also in the emotions. And nobody knows that better than you guys with the name Code Pink. You know, that was such an emotionally interesting name at the time, particularly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most people don't know what it means. So for anybody listening, though, it came from that George Bush era color-coded alert system, right? Color
Yeah. I mean, it was red alerts and what were they? All
They were
kinds of alerts.
yellow, orange, red, but all designed to justify going to war. So while we are waiting for people to go in, to come in, let's see. We can just keep chatting, VJ. If Michelle, we're allowed to just chat before we start, right?
I hope
Definitely.
so.
Definitely. And also, I just want to say, everyone, please introduce yourself in the chat, say where you're coming from, and all of that.
Excellent.
Well,
I
yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, when we talk about the art and so on, I just wrote a little gallery section for Malak Matar, who's the young
Oh, I love
Palestinian
her.
artist. Yeah, she was, in 2014, Medea, after the war, she was like an 11-year-old young girl, and her mother sent her to a UN school for art, for kind of art therapy. It's really quite sad that in this reconstruction period, the UN agencies are so battered that you're not going to see a new generation have art classes. You know, they're barely going to be eating. But for Malak, that art class was so important. And look at what she has become now, just in her 20s and an extraordinary artist.
I have one of her paintings at home. It's one of my great treasures. She is amazing. And one day when we're not online, I'll tell you a story about her when she came to visit. But yeah, she is just beautiful artist and a beautiful person.
Yeah, and I keep thinking about the next generation of people like her. Where will they come from? What stories will they tell? You
But there
know,
are a lot of artists that are coming out of Gaza right now.
absolutely. And that's it. I mean, we should keep an eye on them because it is interesting how the voices of young Palestinians are so quickly suppressed otherwise. We don't give them space. Nobody else is really going to give them space.
Well, you probably know the great, one of the many great programs, We Are Not Numbers, that
Hmm.
he's really given not just a voice, but mentees to help in the English writing and all of that for years now, way before October 7th.
Yeah, and that one of the people, Ahmed, who is at Palestine Deep Dive, he lost his whole family during the genocide, his entire family. He happened to not be in the house then. But he has done a book for We Are Not Numbers. And now we are sort of searching together for memoirs written by Palestinian survivors. And we want to do a series of books. We're starting with one which is by a journalist who was imprisoned by the Israelis. And I want to do like a series of these books to have voices from this genocide. Not one book with a lot of voices, but a whole series of them. You know,
Fabulous. Yeah, that is great. Well, I see we have people coming in from all over the country as well as Canada. And Elaine from Belfast, great that you've joined us. And I think, VJ, we can get started.
great.
So I am very excited about our time together now. One, because I always love talking to you, and two, because I have so many questions about what's happening in Latin America right now. And for those of you who don't know the wonderful VJ, he's a historian and a journalist, author of, what is it, 40 books, VJ? I don't know.
Something like that.
I don't know how you can keep writing so many wonderful books like Washington Bullets, Red Star over the Third World, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. That was one you wrote with Noam Chomsky. You are prolific and everyone is excellent. And you are the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, that puts out fabulous material, and chief correspondent for Globetrotter and the chief editor of Leftward Books. Amazing all that you do, and do it so beautifully. And we are just so happy to have you with us tonight. So VJ, let's just start with situating where Latin America is right now in light of Trump's revival of the Monroe Doctrine and what that means in practice for the region.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, if anybody's had a chance to read the National Security Strategy of 2025, I know that it's been mocked a lot. And there is this habit of mocking things coming out of the Trump administration. There's a way in which people so easily say, well, he said something dumb or whatever. In fact, the text is very interesting, Medea, because it suggests a couple of things. One, it comes to term pretty realistically with the position of China in the world. It basically says, look, we can contest them, but it's not going to be so easy. So rather than put too much of our resources into contesting China, let's consolidate our so-called backyard. Biden rather clumsily said that Latin America is not the United States backyard, but the front yard, to which, one should react that it's nobody's yard. It's its own house. I mean, it's not the United States front or backyard. It was a very clumsy statement by Biden. But Trump came out now directly and saying it's ours. And his Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine effectively is use any power to secure Latin America. Because if the United States doesn't secure Latin America, forget about dominion over the rest of the world. So you see this from El Salvador, where the US has made such a strong relationship with Nayib Bukele, so much so that Bari Weiss had to spike the 60-minute story on Bukele's prisons.
They forgot to do it in Canada, right?
They forgot, and therefore it's circulating on the internet. But south of the Mexican border, all the way down to Chile and Argentina, the United States putting a lot of pressure to push for right-wing electoral victories. I mean, Trump went to the extent, Medea, of saying to the people of Buenos Aires province in the local elections, that if you don't vote for Javier Milei's right-wing candidates, then the United States is not going to greenlight funds for the Argentinian government. And in fact, that may have had an impact on those local elections. So there is a sense that from somewhere around El Salvador, all the way right down to Argentina and Chile, the US is pushing hard to consolidate power. And in fact, it's a realistic option because the center left has almost collapsed in Latin America. And the left in Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and so on is under immense pressure, as you are seeing with the kind of pressure campaign on Venezuela now, which is also, by the way, a pressure campaign on Cuba. So you are seeing this take place in real time. It's not a stupid national security strategy. It's extraordinarily realistic and scary.
Well, when you say it's realistic when it comes to China, a lot of its focus on Latin America is to get China out of Latin America. And even though on the part they don't even mention the word China, you know they're talking about China. So how realistic is that part of it, given that China is the major trade partner with so many countries in Latin America?
Well, that is actually the major problem the US faces, because it's one thing to come to a country like Chile, where, now from March, we're going to have a very far right wing, extreme right wing president, Jose Antonio Cast. By the way, scarily, Jose Antonio Cast, Maria Corina Machado of Venezuela, these people are all exactly my age. And I've always thought that the far right should be older than me, but now the far right is my generation. So Jose Antonio Cast and I born in the same year. Maria Corina Machado and I born in the same year. Very scary feeling just for me personally. But, what does Chile do? Chile exports copper, exports iron ore, exports lithium. Where does it send it to? China. Now, the United States cannot easily find a substitute for China to buy Chile's iron ore, for instance. The US manufacturing is simply not at that scale. So the only way the US can do this is by finding an alternative to China. Currently, there is none. So the United States can politically push China out of the picture, but not commercially or economically until, and here's the big question, until Mr. Trump is able to revive manufacturing in the United States, which is a really tall order, Medea, especially at the levels at which it would require to buy soybeans from Brazil, to buy iron ore from Chile, to buy all the fruits of the Andes. It's just not going to happen. China is the largest trading partner of Chile, for instance, and it's very unlikely that the government of Jose Antonio Cast is going to be able to have an anti-China policy. I mean, he can do it, but he's going to wipe out the businesses of the very structure that wanted him in power. For instance, just to give you one example, lithium. The largest lithium company in Chile is a big mining company called SMQ. During the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, SMQ was handed over to Pinochet's son-in-law. Currently, SMQ is owned by Pinochet's granddaughter. Now, if Mr. Cass, who is a great fan of Augusto Pinochet, decides to break ties with China economically, SMQ will go bankrupt. So here's the contradiction. You've got a pro-Pinochetista coming to power, but he cannot impact the Pinochet family with the kind of policies the US wants.
Let's go back to a minute to what you said about the Monroe Doctrine and Biden saying it was the front yard, and Trump being very clear about how we want to dominate Latin America. How much is this a change? And if it is significant, is it attributable to Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, or is this just a continuation of US pressure in Latin America?
Well, this is always the question, isn't it? I mean, the Democrats, the Republicans, the Tweedledees, the Tweedledums. I mean, obviously, there's enormous continuities, but there's also a great change, which is that Trump is far more aggressive in his foreign policy than Mr. Biden. And Mr. Trump, unlike Biden, openly doesn't care that he's allying with people who are pretty disreputable. I mean, Nayib Bukele may be, extremely popular in El Salvador. It's actually the case that he's very popular in El Salvador, but he's running effectively a campaign in El Salvador that is identical to what has brought the Philippines' former president, Mr. Duterte, to the International Criminal Court, which was that Mr. Duterte effectively carried out extrajudicial assassinations of people suspected of being drug dealers in the Philippines. He is sitting, in front of the Hague facing charges. But here's the interesting thing. Nayib Bukele is doing the exact same thing. So is Donald Trump. The killing of 100 people in small boats off the coast of Venezuela that's also extrajudicial assassinations of suspected drug dealers. We don't know anything about them. They may have nothing to do with drugs, most likely. But this was an extrajudicial assassination similar to what was conducted by Barack Obama in Waziristan, extrajudicial assassination by drone. In that case, it was not on the war on drugs, it was the war on terror. United States has mastered this whole war on something as rhetoric to conduct extrajudicial assassinations. Is this different from Biden or Obama or anybody? Perhaps in tone to some extent. I mean, there's no question that Mr. Trump talks differently than Joe Biden. But I mean, again, to give you that example, front yard, backyard, if you are a Latin American country seeking sovereignty, you really don't want this sort of language. Whether you are being bombed or you have sanctions, one way or the other, the United States is trying to dominate you. And it's unpalatable whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. So, yeah, Mr. Trump is being much more, in a sense, disciplined about the campaign to redominate or recolonize Latin America. But it's not a huge change. Is it Marco Rubio? I don't think so. I think this is coming directly from Trump's realist foreign policy.
Well, but is it realist if he has been telling people in Congress, or Marco Rubio when he briefed them, that we're not going to go invade Venezuela, and Trump knows that his base, whether they call themselves MAGA or traditional Republicans or whatever, the vast majority don't want the US to be militarily involved in Venezuela. What is Trump's plan now? People say that he's gotten himself in a bind because he doesn't want to invade, and yet his pressure is not going to make Maduro just say, okay, I cry uncle, I'm going to leave.
Well, I think that the Venezuelan people are calling the US bluff. I mean, look at how this played out, Medea. This is over the course of the second half of 2025. How did this play out? United States, just from nowhere, assembles an armada and puts it at the edge of Venezuela. I mean, there was this long Barbados process where the government of Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan government, came and discussed with the opposition. They created a roadmap to the elections, the last presidential election. People agreed to it. Maria Corina Machado's team was extremely reticent about the Barbados process. You see, people need to understand that she made comments directly saying that the United States should invade her country. She's recently said it's an act of love to call for the US to invade. But let's forget about the recent statements. It was because of this planning with the United States, which, by any law in any country would be considered treason. She was forbidden to run for elections. So her proxy ran for. There's been a long process of attempted normalization. Chevron opened talks with the Maduro government. So this process was ongoing of a kind of easing of tensions between the US and Venezuela. Suddenly, Mr. Trump sends this armada in, starts to target these small boats, seizes an oil tanker headed to Cuba. This is, by the way, complete violation of the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea, which doesn't permit this kind of piracy to take place. This buildup takes place in anticipation of Maria Corina Machado, most unlikely recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. But then on the other hand, your old friend Barack Obama won the prize. I remember the day when he said, you should listen to her. Remember that. Although he called you the young lady, which would have been Medea. He called you, I think he called you the young lady, right?
Yes, he did. And I'm 10 years older than him, but I don't mind that part.
Medea, flattery on age is always acceptable. Yeah. So anyway, one could call it patronizing or flattery. Either way, he said we should listen to Mr. Obama, won the Nobel Peace Prize as well. But here's Maria Corina Machado winning the prize, the head of the Nobel Committee announcing Mr. Maduro should leave, massive pressure campaign build up on Venezuela, threats of a military attack. But to be honest, there was never the possibility that the US was going to invade Venezuela, because an invasion of Venezuela is much more reckless than the invasion, the illegal attack by the US on Iraq. Why? Because the Iraqi army in 2003 had already been significantly eroded. Its morale was near zero. And yet in Iraq, the army became a resistance force, a guerrilla force. Yet that happened. In Venezuela, the Bolivarian army is much more disciplined, much more prepared to go, neighborhood to neighborhood. And now they have armed the communes, they've armed the people. This is not going to be easy. This is going to be a bay of pigs, if anything. So the US can bomb Venezuela. It's very unlikely that it can invade Venezuela. Does Mr. Trump have a walk back strategy on this? I think in the end of the day, he's going to make a deal with Nicolas Maduro. Maria Corina Machado is going to be living in Madrid, and things will go on in this uneasy way for another period. I don't think we're going to see a war by the US against Venezuela. I just don't see anybody able to find a strategy that's easy for the United States with that country.
Well, which really means that Trump does not have a very realistic policy when it comes at least to the Venezuela part of things. You have a scenario that doesn't include war, but I'm not so sure about that. And for those who are listening, we hope you'll join on to the Code Pink Rapid Response Network. And we'll put the link in the chat, because we do want to keep putting out ideas of how we could try to stop this. Because my feeling, Vijay, having spent so much time in Congress, is that there is huge division everywhere. There's divisions within the Republicans. There's huge opposition within the Democrats. Of course, a lot of that is because it's a Republican in the White House. But in any case, we almost got the War Powers Act passed in the House and in the Senate, and it came very close. And there's going to be another chance at that soon, probably in the Senate. So we want people to join up and be taking actions regularly, be out on the streets. In fact, I'm in Miami right now, and I'm missing a demonstration that's happening here tonight. And it is great that there are demonstrations not only all over the country, but I would say well, I would hope all over Latin America. And maybe that's a question for you, Vijay. How much support is there for stopping the US in Latin America, and how is it manifested both at the grassroots and at the top levels?
It's very interesting. I mean, I live in Chile. There's a very large 500,000 Venezuelans living here. They came here because the former president, Sebastián Piñera, invited Venezuelans. So you have a lot of people who are perhaps against the government, but they are against this war. They are against the possibility of a war on their homeland. The sense amongst the population is that this is an unrealistic demand by the Trump administration. An unrealistic demand for Mr. Maduro to leave, and unrealistic to imagine that there'll be a war. I mean, there can always be some sort of attack. It's extremely possible. The United States is unpredictable in this regard. Any minute now, they could bomb Caracas. They have this tendency. Remember, Mr. Trump, for all the talk of anti-interventionism, dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb on a civilian population, and that was in southeastern Afghanistan in his first administration, the so-called mother of all bombs. In that sense, there is a lethality that is there in the Trump administration, a serious lethality. This attack on so-called ISIS that took place recently, another example of that. We have no idea who was hit. The civilian tankers that have been held, where's the crew? What have they been charged with? I mean, shouldn't there be some understanding by the population of who these 100 people that have been bombed in these small boats? So there's a lethality, a complete lack of concern for ordinary people in the Trump administration. So yes, there's always the possibility that they could bomb Caracas, bomb other parts of Venezuela with ferocity, with a kind of shock and awe. But would there be an invasion? That's a real question. Would there be US troops landing in Venezuela? That's a separate issue. I'm not sure the United States has it in its army to actually invade the country.
Well, let's talk about economic sanctions, because with the seizing of these oil tankers already, there is an impact in ships not wanting to go to Venezuela, a decrease in the money that Venezuela is going to have because the oil sales are like 90% of the revenues that are coming in. And what does this mean in terms of getting food into the country? And the fact that these sanctions have already been so horrific and led to so much famine. It's led to, it's led to tremendous numbers of people leaving the country. So what can we say about what is this call for a blockade going to translate into greater economic hardship?
Well, I mean, it's already estimated that the sanctions by the United States, the existing sanctions, the attack on the oil sector is equivalent to twice Venezuela's gross domestic product. And one estimate shows that the losses, the hemorrhaging in Venezuela account for roughly 77 million US dollars a day. Now, that's a lot of money for a relatively poor country like Venezuela. And the humanitarian impact is grotesque. I mean, this has hampered, you said food sector. It's actually hit food and medicine extremely, hard. It's very difficult for Venezuela to import medical supplies, very difficult to import machinery substitutes, to fix things and so on. When the power sector gets hit by sabotage, as it was in the last couple of years, it's very difficult to get equipment into the country to fix the electrical sector. Similar, Medea, to what happens in Cuba when the hurricanes, as they often do, very deeply impact the power sector, electricity sector. It's very hard for Cuba to import equipment to fix the electricity problems in the country. And here, we have to say the role of countries like Mexico, China, Russia, and so on, that have been willing to break the sanctions in order to get equipment or medical supplies. Mexico has played a really important role in this. And it's kudos to the government of Claudia Sheinbaum for standing up to the Trump administration and providing much needed supplies to Cuba and Venezuela in these very difficult times. But yeah, $77 million a day might not sound a lot to people, but it's a lot for a country like Venezuela, whose external revenues has collapsed as a consequence of loss of about 90% of its oil revenues.
Well, I see in the comments, and hello to Cheryl from the National Network on Cuba, but she said that some shipping commentators point out that there is limited storage for pumped oil and will cause the shutdown of the oil industry. What do you think about that?
This is a problem in the oil industry. It's a permanent problem. When oil prices go down, oil companies hire tankers, they fill the tankers up and have them sit at sea. And currently this is part of the problem, is that there are not that many tankers around. If tankers are not willing to come to Venezuela to fill the oil is being pumped out. It's not being processed in Venezuela. That's a big problem, that Venezuela doesn't have processing capacity. Its own processing has been offshored, which means it has to tank the pumped out oil. It has to send it for processing and for use. Otherwise, they're going to have to shut down wells. This is a problem. You shut down a oil well, it takes a long time to restart it. It's not an automatic, easy process, which is why oil companies pump out the oil, put it into tankers, send it at sea to basically be warehoused. This is a serious problem for a country like Venezuela, particularly because, again, machinery is hard to re-import. it's very difficult because also the funds to import machinery is not there. When you shut down a well, you're going to need to bring in new machinery. You're going to need to have a sort of serious engineering issues are at stake and so on. When you talk to people in Venezuela, they will tell you directly that this is not a trivial matter. At the central bank of Venezuela, Carlos Mendoza Portelli, he's an expert at this, has for a long time warned about the serious impact of the slowdown of Venezuela's ability to sell its oil, because it has effects downstream all the way to the engineering capacity of the wells.
Well, there is also a question about Russia, China, and the BRICS. Are they coming in to help Venezuela? What do you say to that? And we didn't really get into the issue of how much support there is for stopping intervention throughout Latin America, top and down and bottom up.
Well, first, I would say that the issue of Latin America in general is being severely weakened. There's what I call the angry tide that has taken over Latin America, from south of Mexico all the way down to the southern cone. You're seeing the resurgence of the extreme right wing. I mean, just to give you a quick update on that, Chile, extreme right president; Argentina, extreme right president; Bolivia, right-wing president, but really he is an extreme rightist because he's answering to an extreme right legislature. Brazil, okay, it's Lula, but the Chamber of Deputies extreme right-wing, Bolsonarista, and in the next election, most likely the Bolsonaro supporters will control the Senate. Lula is extraordinarily constrained in what he can do. You go up the Andes, Medea, it's one right-wing country after the other. Noboa, Ecuador, Peru. You've got the next election in Colombia. If Vicky Davila, who's extremely popular journalist, comes in on the right, Ivan Cepeda, the candidate of the left, has got no chance, in my opinion. I don't think Gustavo Petro's legacy will be cemented. And then you enter the Caribbean, you've got a president, a prime minister in Trinidad and Tobago, Kamala Prasad, who's gone completely to the right, pro-Trump to the extreme. So where's the support for Venezuela in this? I mean, it's not happening in Latin America. Sorry to say, that whole pink tide has become an angry tide. It's not there. When it comes to China and Russia, let's take them sequentially because they're not identical. China has been, as you've seen, slowly coming out of its shell. After the opening up and reform in 1978, Chinese foreign policy became extraordinarily reticent to get involved in external problems. They took seriously the idea that your sovereignty is yours and we should not interfere in your country. They took that to an extreme, so that even on situations like Palestine and so on, the Chinese haven't put many UN Security Council resolutions on the table. Russia, on the other hand, has been a little more, intervention-y, sympathetic. Like they've been more aggressive in helping their allies. You saw that in Syria. You're seeing that now in the Sahel region in Africa, and certainly in Venezuela. The Russians have made it very clear to the United States they will not tolerate, the overthrow of the government, and so they have been providing support and sustenance. The Venezuelan government does have a lifeline to some extent, trade with Iran, trade with Turkey and so on. But it's not, it's not sufficient. I mean, we're not seeing, for instance, anybody try to challenge the US Armada. I mean, that would be extremely reckless and dangerous. Imagine a Russian warship entering the Caribbean. It would be extremely reckless and dangerous. These countries, the BRICS countries, want peace. And that little segment that went viral of Maduro saying, peace, not war, which has become like a rock anthem now. And Maduro repeats it all the time. Peace, not war. Peace, yes. War, no. He does it in English. It's really quite funny and entertaining. But that's the view of the BRICS countries, China, Russia. They don't want to confront the United States because the US might actually attack a Russian ship and escalate what they're already escalating in Ukraine. So we are not going to see any major escalation from the Chinese. They are not going to send warships to defend Venezuela. I mean, and that's the sad thing. The Latin American countries are not going to stand up to the United States, except, to some extent, of course, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, right now, Colombia, and so on, but not really. What are they capable of doing? Not much.
Well, before we move on to other issues, I think a final question on this is coming from Laura Gibney, who says, how can Venezuela and Cuba possibly survive this blockade of oil? And I was just in Cuba recently, and it is so, so sad how the strangulation has been tightened so much, and Cuban people are really, really hurting. And so, this blockade is tightening now. At the same time, there is a cancellation of temporary protective status for Venezuelans. Cubans are not welcome in the US anymore. How will they survive?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that the first thing is for people who say things like, I'm 100% want to defend the Cuban Revolution, but I have problems with Venezuela. That attitude, the sort of consumerism of politics, where you feel like you make personal choices. Let me just say quite bluntly that if tomorrow the Bolivarian process collapses in Venezuela, the Cuban Revolution may not survive. I mean, these two processes are inextricably linked. And I think it would be naive for anybody to believe that they make personal choices saying, well, Miguel Diaz-Canel is a great guy, I don't like Maduro. I mean, this is just a trivial approach to politics, because where you can actually see the hand of Marco Rubio is they understand that if they are able to overthrow the government in Caracas, Cuba will be completely isolated. And that's going to be hard. It's going to be like a special period for Cuba. They're already in a permanent special period, but this would be immensely worse. So the defense of Venezuela's sovereignty is really the defense of the Cuban Revolution as well. But yeah, I mean, the assault on Cuba is at a level, it's completely extreme. I was looking at some numbers earlier. I mean, the strain, particularly fuel blockages and the prevention of machinery. I mean, there were a few Chinese ships that brought electrical machinery to Cuba, but I'll say it quite bluntly, Medea, I'm waiting for the day where an armada of ships arrives from Asia carrying all kinds of equipment, to build a new kind of power plant, to build a high-speed rail that connects one end of Cuba to the other. I can't wait to see that armada, the peace armada, arrive from Asia. I mean, it's one of my great hopes, and I've written about this in the Chinese press, saying, please, Cuba deserves it. When Fidel Castro died, the great Fidel Castro, when he died, for the only time a Chinese leader has gone to a foreign embassy to pay condolence was when Xi Jinping went to pay condolence in the Cuban embassy in Beijing for Fidel Castro. I mean, the Cuban Revolution means a lot in China, and I just can't wait for all of that Chinese ingenuity and skill to be put at the disposal of the Cuban people. But I don't know why it's taking so long to happen, Medea, but it's one of my great hopes.
Well, another dream is to have a flotilla that goes from Florida, maybe from Tampa, to Cuba. And, look at all the enthusiasm of people around the world with the flotilla that went, or the ones that tried to get to Gaza. So I think we should do a flotilla to Cuba. And if you're interested, put it in the chat and we will follow up, because this is the time. We might not have the same capacity as China does to take stuff to Cuba, but we could have 1,000 or way more than that lanterns, because they need the solar lights. Let's take them to Cuba and show our absolute disgust with what our government is doing to make life miserable for the Cuban people in the name of bringing democracy to Cuba. So let's
By the
move
way,
on.
I just want to say I love that idea. I think it's a terrific idea. If you're going to do a flotilla from Miami, I think there should be one from Mexico called the Granma Flotilla, which is
Oh, nice.
a Latin American flotilla that joins with the Miami flotilla. That would be extraordinary.
Beautiful, but I think Tampa might be a little more politically sympathetic. In Miami, not sure about that. Anyway, if you're interested in the flotilla idea, put it in the chat or just contact me directly, medea@codepink.org. And yes, now we got the idea of a Mexico one at the same time. Very cool. So let's move on, BJ, and talk about a little bit about this drug issue. Because while we dismiss it in terms of the justification that this administration is using to blow up ships off the coasts of Venezuela or on the Atlantic now and Pacific side, there are a lot of drugs coming into the US, and it is a problem. And there's a huge problem of crime and violence in Latin America because of these drugs. So how should I mean, did Petro in Colombia has he been able to put a dent into this, or where is there who has ideas of how to deal with it in a way that's not just blowing people up?
Well, just to let you know that in the early part of this year, in February, Tricontinental will publish a dossier which is on this drugs issue. We've been working with peasant organizations in Colombia to build this text. It explains what the drug issue is. It offers some suggestions. I mean, the principal thing to understand is that Venezuela plays almost a negligible role in the entire drugs economy. I mean, it's not happening from Venezuela. The drugs are grown in those drugs that come from Latin America largely come from Colombia. That is where the coca plants are mostly grown, harvested. The processing happens there. They are generally transshipped from the Pacific coastline of Central America, also Mexico, into the United States. They're not coming from the Caribbean. The Caribbean is almost negligible. And so that's very important. And that's data that comes to us from the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States government. Also, the United Nations, their Drug and Crime Office also has similar numbers. But it's important to understand that Mr. Trump needs to read the reports of his own agencies. There is almost no drugs coming from Venezuela. There is some Colombian drugs that are occasionally taken across into the Venezuelan side of the border and warehoused there, brought back to Colombia, and that's where they come up north. So we'll have a full dossier in February of the coming year on this issue. Now, what can you do to fight this war on drugs? It's a multifaceted thing. You can't just go and bomb the peasants of Colombia. The United States has tried it. It's called Plan Colombia. It was funded in 2000. It, in fact, empowered paramilitary right-wing thugs in Colombia to go after peasant leaders. In working with the campesinos, I visited Cauca, visited Medellin, visited the rural areas, talked to campesino or peasant leaders. They will tell you pretty directly that, look, we are dealing with the problem. We have a problem of economics. If we could grow other things, if we could grow fruit, if we could grow potatoes, we would do it. But the pricing just doesn't work for us. We need to have an economic solution. There needs to be the prevention of dumping of cheap agricultural goods coming from the United States, dumped in our country, dropping prices and so on. What is called dumping in international trade needs to be taken seriously at that end. Within the United States, there needs to be a serious discussion about addiction. I mean, people are getting addicted to opiates, for instance, That has a lot to do with the pharmaceutical industry. It has to do with pain management. It has to do with how doctors have been prescribing opiates where it's perhaps not necessary. I mean, the question of the drug problem in the US has to do with atomization, alienation, lack of meaning in people's lives. This is what the government should be dealing with. You know, loneliness. I don't know if you know this, Medea, but hundreds of millions of people die every year because of loneliness and atomization. Needs to be dealt with. There needs to be a new national project. There needs to be a whole discussion about unemployment, about the so-called meth land that has been created in the central parts of the United States, where farming has been killed off and small farmers are surviving by producing crystal meth in little laboratories and so on. This is a discussion for the US. It's not a discussion about fentanyl. You know, fentanyl is merely a component drug of these other drugs. Let's discuss who's making them in these little labs. What's happening to the farmers of Iowa? What's happening to the farmers of Ohio? These small farmers are being decimated by agribusiness. So this is a much broader question about civilization, not a narrow question about some small little cigarette boat with 6 people on it. You blow up 6 people on a tiny cigarette boat, you're not solving the problem, Donald. You got to deal with the big picture. It makes for great television, but it's not good policy.
Well, going back to this, what you call the angry tide in Latin America, part of that, what I read, I don't know if it's true, is people upset about crime. How big an issue is that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, people may have followed that in Rio de Janeiro a couple of months ago, the local government sent in effectively the militarized police to go in there and kill 121 people. No idea how many civilians amongst them, level of outrage negligible. There is immense support amongst parts of the working class, poor people in Latin America for the way that Nayib Bukele has dealt with the drug issue. And here's the limitation of the left. You see, the right has a pretty easy solution. They understand that the issue of crime and drugs impacts working class communities. That's where young children, for instance, are either dragged into addiction or they are dragged into the gangs, one way or the other. So parents are pretty happy when they see the militarized police show up and shoot a drug dealer in the head. You know, they think, oh, that's great, dealt with. The left's only answer to this is we talk about, you know, well, this is against human rights and, you know, what about the law and so on. We don't have a really good story for the question of crime and the epidemic of drugs in working class neighborhoods. We don't know what to talk about. We haven't given this much thought, Medea. I mean, even in our struggles, you know, what do? We talk about alternatives. You know, let's have a music school. These are not credible ways to deal with this. There is a serious problem. It's extremely violent. There's lots of guns involved. The reaction is going to have to be a state reaction. I'm not sure what we have that's different from Nayib Bukele. I mean, just speaking quite plainly and honestly, I don't know what the answer is. And if the left is paralyzed, has no answer to this, you know, I can only say that what Bukele is doing is cruel and against human rights. We are going to lose entire sections of the population to the right. And that's, to me, unacceptable. We need to have an answer to this. We need to develop an answer. I have some ideas, but this is not, you know, your ideas, my ideas. These need to be socialized, debated, explored in public policy and so on. And I don't think as yet we've had the courage to have this debate openly.
Well, part of the answer you've already talked about, which is giving economic alternatives to farmers. And, you know, I was always so excited. I don't think you ever liked the term pink tide, but with the pink tides, it was inspirational here in the United States to see these progressive governments that seem to be doing things for their people. Evo Morales in Bolivia, certainly Lula. And the way that it was portrayed, at least to me, is that they were popular because they were improving the lives of people. And so was that really true? And then why does the left have such a hard time right now if they were delivering economic benefits to the people?
Well, in Bolivia, it's really quite complicated because in the 14 years of Evo Morales' government, he did improve the conditions of particularly the indigenous people. I mean, he is the first indigenous president in the country, and he really pushed hard to erase poverty and to industrialize the country and so on. I think I give him, I doff my cap to him. I think after he was removed in a coup, it distorted the politics in the country. The whole thing fell apart. But I don't think we can say that Morales lost the opportunity. I think he really pushed a great deal that was good. I think that in other countries, Medea, in Chile is a terrific example of this. Gabriel Boric had no project for the people. He basically became a comma in a long sentence written by the right wing. There was no real policy, and that was a wasted opportunity. I think Kirchnerism in Argentina was a similar comma in a right-wing sentence. I think they also missed the opportunity. They tried to do some things, but insufficient use of the state to drive an alternative economic policy. I think they were basically doing more social welfare for people, transferring wealth to people, income to people as much as possible, but not really driving a separate new agenda. Like the birthplace of Che Guevara, which is Rosario, Argentina, is now a hub of the drug industry. It should not be that. It should be something other than that. Why didn't they have for the youth of Rosario a project, some sort of project of industry or project of even artistry? There's so many opportunities. Build a new university there. Use the social wealth to invest in the country. I mean, let's take the case of Medellin. Long before Gustavo Petro came to power, in fact, there was a mayor of the center left in Medellin after 2002. They increased social programs in the city. Okay, that's all they did was increase social programs. They had a big project of community participation, and guess what? Crime declined in the city pretty dramatically. Same thing in several Mexican cities. The moment you increase social programs, you bring in community participation, you create community centers, you have community, decision making and so on. You bring the community in to solve problems of their neighborhood. There's no single solution. Bukeleism has the advantage of saying one solution: go in and shoot the drug dealer. In fact, the solution of the left is multiplicity. It's community participation. Bring the community in, have more community planning, have more discussions. For God's sake, build a community center where people can gather, where you don't have to rent it. It's not a commercial space. It's owned by the community and so on. The moment you have community participation, where there's decision making about resources, they know best what's best for their kids. If they want a music classes in the community center, hold those. If you want training for this, that, hold those. There's a lot that can be done that targets the so-called Gen Z or the young people. And I would say the other thing that's important, which we learned from a place like Cuba, it's not only youth education and so on, it's also mental health. I mean, you need much more counseling for young people. There's a lot of traumas that young people are dealing with today, and we just don't take all that seriously. The state has basically walked away from dealing with that with young people. Drug use among youth is largely about the lack of mental health care for them. The care economy has become so gendered and privatized that this is part of the reason why we are seeing a rise of drug use in some of these communities.
Well, let's talk about Brazil for a minute because one, it's such an important big country, and two, because there has been for years and years so much grassroots organizing. The left party, the PT, so organized, the unions, and there have been good government programs that have involved people, like you're saying. And that's one reason why Lula is still very popular and will likely win the elections next year. But on the other hand, you do have this rise of the right. So, why in a place like Brazil is there so much support for the right wing if the government has been responsive to people?
Well, it's always scary talking on a webinar that's being recorded and that'll be public, to say the truth. But I think it's worth saying that the Workers' Party of Brazil is really not organized as a party. It's an election vehicle. I mean, Mr. Lula is going to win not because of the Workers' Party, but because he's Mr. Lula. He's 80 years old, for God's sake, and he's going to be running to be the president of the country again for another term. He'll be the oldest head of state. By the time that his term ends, his fourth term will end. He is extraordinarily popular. He is going to win the election. I'm not sure the PT will play an enormous role in that. And the reason I say
Why
that,
is Lula popular?
well, Lula is popular because he is an extraordinary, what used to be called, when Bill Clinton was around, used to be called a retail politician. I mean, he is an extremely amazing person when it comes to connecting with the electorate. He can talk to the electorate. He knows how to lift up their views. He's extraordinarily empathetic, compassionate in the way he campaigns and so on. That's his popularity, Medea. What are the policies right now that he has been able to drive through? He is stuck with a right-wing legislature in Brasilia. The provincial governments are basically of the right. São Paulo state has a right-wing government. I mean, Rio, we just saw they sent in the militarized police to kill 121 people. The jails are overcrowded in Brazil. I mean, Mr. Lula is not able to actually drive even a social democratic politics within the country. He just doesn't have the political clout for it. The PT has not been able to elect people at all levels of government. That's why I say that you have Mr. Lula at the top, but then below, there really isn't a kind of electoral strategy of the PT to win at the provincial level, to win at the city level, mayors of city, to win at the Chamber of Deputies, Senate, etc. So the country is actually politically a country of the right, with a president who is center left. And that's the tragedy of Brazil, that Mr. Lula has great ideas, super empathetic, amazing guy, but he can't drive a legislative agenda. He's completely blocked and he knows it, which is why his government actually is not a government of even the center left. It's a government of the center right. He has had to make alliances with people of the right in order to even get a modest agenda through Brasilia. Otherwise, he'd get nothing done. I mean, in that sense, Mr. Lula is governing from the center right, not from the center left. And that's the situation largely in Brazil today. I mean, there are some external contradictions that prevent Brazil from moving rightward. One of them being that its largest trading partner is China. And that the BRICS project is extremely important for Brazilian foreign policy. That prevents Brazil from drifting, like India, from drifting further rightward. I mean, India is held in foreign policy terms by the BRICS, just as Brazil is.
Well, I just want to remind people who are listening, and I know they're doing that in a variety of platforms tonight, to send us your questions because we have 1/2 hour more to be continuing this discussion. And I want to move, Vijay, to the issue of elections that we have talked about a little bit, but I want you to give us a sense of the US interference in elections, some of the cases where it's so obvious, overt, and some of the cases where it might be a little more covert, but still there.
Well, this is the arena which needs a lot more investigation and analysis. I mean, we really need to understand this further. What has happened to elections? You know, the amount of money, covert and overt, or declared and undeclared, is unbelievable. I mean, the amount of money that has overcome elections, I don't even. I think it's inaccurate to call these democratic elections. These are money elections. The cost of advertisements, the cost of hiring people to go and canvass. These are not volunteers. On the right, you have a lot of money spent putting up billboards, this, that, and the other. It's extremely expensive to get your candidate known to everybody. So that's number one, the money problem. Secondly, the media problem. You don't need US intervention media because the media is owned by large corporate houses. They are typically pro-United States for a variety of reasons. You want media interference? Here's media interference. A couple of years ago, during the Biden administration, at the time, Antony Blinken was the Secretary of State. You may have already forgotten him, Medea, but remember that name, the electric guitarist Antony Blinken. Well, Antony Blinken he signed a report by the US State Department accusing two media outlets in Latin America of being Russian mouthpieces. One of them is Presenza, based in New York City, very small outlet. They carry our Globetrotter material. I don't see how Antony Blinken had even heard of them. And the second one was El Ciudadano, which is based in Santiago, Chile, edited by my friend Bruno Sommers, also carries Globetrotter material, accused both of being Chinese outlets. It's ridiculous, what the US has been doing. And at the same time, they got Africa Stream shut down, edited by Ahmed Caballo from Kenya. They got that shut down from Instagram and so on. They had millions of followers. The US government intervened to stop small media. I was one of the people who helped found NewsClick in India. The New York Times, the US government colluded to shut down NewsClick, send our editor Prabir Prokayastha to prison for several months. I mean, it's completely crazy. So small media outlets, they attack. Meanwhile, the giant media houses, whether it's Globo in Brazil or in Chile, there's a number of them. These are promoted by the US government as free and fair media. This is media of money. So you have money elections, the interference of money in elections, declared and undeclared. You have the influence of media in elections. The left has no chance. It gets pilloried in this corporate media. In Chile, you had an election between a communist who's pretty popular among large sections of the population, Janet Hara. She got about 41% of the vote, which is pretty incredible in a country marinated in anti-communism. And then you had an actual fascist whose father was basically led out of Germany. He could have been a convicted war criminal, led out of Germany by the Vatican and the US government, brought to Chile. His son, who is pro-Pinochet, was running against the government, and he got 58% of the vote. I mean, the media completely sanitized Jose Antonio Cast. There was no question of any of these things. Cast saying that if Pinochet was alive, he'd vote for me. I mean, this kind of attitude was, but it also reveals, and this is the third point. The first is money, second media. The third point is we misunderestimate, to quote George W. Bush, we misunderestimate the level of right-wing culture in Latin America and the power of the right-wing evangelical churches, which entered here and have actually eclipsed the Catholic Church in many countries. The evangelical tide in Argentina, in Chile, across Central America. You'll remember that during the dirty wars, so-called dirty wars in Central America, the evangelical churches played a really nasty role at the time. Pat Robertson and others backing the dictators fully, and so on. These churches have entered here. The levels of homophobia, anti-LGBTQ, the kind of pro-natalist agenda of J.D. Vance heavily promoted in this part of the world, this pro-natalist idea that women should stop thinking of their careers and they need to have more children. The right-wing cultural current is actually playing a big role here. And I think we shouldn't underestimate its power. And something that the United States can easily pick up on, particularly the Trump administration, combination of Steve Bannon, who's played a role in this part of the world, and Vox, the right-wing party in Spain. Vox created a platform called the Madrid Forum, or Foro Madrid. Oops, we're having an earthquake here. Everything is shaking a little bit, but I think it's okay. It was a pretty big earthquake. Anyway, the Madrid Forum, or Foro Madrid, set up by Vox, the role of Steve Bannon, they've basically entered into Latin America and they've lifted up the worst of this right-wing culture, which exists in the society, this anti-women thing, pro-natalist, and so they lifted this up. They've pushed this forward, and with the money power and media power, they've created large enough blocks for people like Javier Milei, for people like Jair Bolsonaro. The just open kind of heartlessness of the politics, harsh attacks on migrants and so on. It's pretty ridiculous, because just as in the United States, in Argentina, the migrants are very poor Bolivians. In Chile, the anti-migrant stuff is intense. And the migrants here, what they call are Venezuelans, who were brought here as part of the political attack on Nicolas Maduro. I mean, it's all muddled and crazy. But the themes will resonate for the J.D. Vances, for that crowd, the now dead Charlie Kirk. It's this anti-immigrant, anti-women's rights. Women need to have more. Our women need to have more children. Homosexuality and feminism is against childbirthing of our women, so we have to bring the wrong migrants in. I mean, this weird bunch of ideas travels around, and it's given a platform by the media. And the right has to be defeated on this terrain. We cannot just walk away and say, let's talk about employment. You've got to enter this terrain. They are not really the culture wars. They are wars about how we want to live.
Well, and given that, most of us on this are living here in the United States, are you misunderestimating a bit the role of the US in terms of the carrot and the stick around elections? Like, we'll take your aid away, or we'll give you money if you vote the right way. Hasn't that been very important in recent elections?
I think it plays a big role. I mean, for sure in Argentina, they say it played a role when Trump directly said them. It's a direct intervention. It plays a very big role. And as I said, we don't even know where the money comes from. If you look at the CIA documents from the elections in the 1950s in Chile, the US government directly funded the campaign of Eduardo Frei and others, directly funded it. That's in the documents collected by Peter Kornblum, published by the New Press, in the big Chile reader that they have. It's very clear from the past, the US directly funded election campaigns. Not impossible that they've continued that policy. It's just that we have to wait another 25, 30 years before we get to see the CIA documents of the past 10 years. But I'm sure that they've intervened in this period. And it's a strange thing, there is a lot of intervention, but some of it also is things that you don't see. And you may never get to see, which is the collusions that take place, the decisions made. I mean, why did Michelle Bachelet, for instance, who was an extremely popular president in Chile right after the dictatorship, several people thought that she would run against Jose Antonio Cast from the left, center-left candidate. And if she did, she would likely have defeated him easily. Why didn't she run? Well, some people say she has been promised to become the next Secretary General of the United Nations. And so that was a deal that the US made with her. And she cemented that deal by attacking Venezuela when she was at the UN agency on human rights. She put forward a report that was extremely bad, and she made a deal with them. Well, maybe that's true. Now it turns out that Trump might be backing somebody from Ecuador, another woman, not Michelle Bachelet, stab in the back. But all these deals also happen. This is a form of intervention. You are interfering in the politics of a country. It happens all the time. It's casual. It's sometimes reported, but often we don't hear about it because guess what, Medea? We go to the wrong cocktail parties.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Vijay, that with cuts in U.S. Foreign aid, this is less of a stick these days or a carrot, how you look at it, of saying we're going to take away your money because a lot of that money is gone. But maybe we could talk about the Caribbean for a bit because, it used to be that the Caribbean was a lot of progressive governments and CARICOM as a umbrella grouping, quite progressive, but yet we see Trinidad and Tobago playing into the Trump attacks on Venezuela. We see the Dominican Republic doing that as well. What's the general political scene in the Caribbean these days?
Well, I wrote an article about Prasad Basesar's politics. It was published by Globetrotter. You can read it at People's Dispatch. I was
That's in
interested
Trinidad
in,
and Tobago, right?
yes, she is the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. She's a long-time politician. She comes from, I wouldn't call it the left, but certainly not the right wing. This is a real turn of face on her part. But what makes this turn of face? Because in fact, all previous prime ministers of Trinidad and Tobago who are alive have attacked her policy of both being so subordinate to the United States and breaking with CARICOM, which is the Caribbean Community, which has taken a position against U.S. intervention in Venezuela. So she has been attacked by all her previous prime ministers. And if we could do this, her previous version of herself would have attacked her. That's the interesting thing. Why did she say she was doing this? She said she was doing this to protect Trinidadians in the United States and to allow Trinidadian migrants from the country to go to the US so that their visas would not be jeopardized. It's a very interesting thing. I'm going to come to that carrot and stick you mentioned. It's true that the United States no longer provides foreign aid or provides USAID funds in one way or the other, whether good or bad, separate question. Yeah. So that tap is not there to turn on and turn off as a political gesture, but immigration is. And a lot of these countries rely upon remittances. They rely upon their educated citizenry, including nurses, a lot of Jamaican, Trinidadian nurses that come to the US. It's a very sad thing that they have to come there. This is another story about International Monetary Fund preventing these countries from paying these sorts of professions a decent salary to remain in country. They get trained almost on the taxpayer's bill in Jamaica, in Trinidad and Tobago, and then they migrate to the United Kingdom, to the United States, and so on, to Canada, to work as nurses in hospitals. Okay, so these countries, Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, rely on tourism, but TNT somewhat less than Jamaica, but they rely on tourism, and they rely on migrants going to the United States and sending back a part of their earnings, which are called remittances, to the home country. In many of these countries, including Trinidad and Tobago, the volume of remittances annually is greater than the foreign direct investment. That means it's a lot of external currency coming into the country through remittances. Now, if she believes, Kamla Prasad Basesar believes, if she didn't bow down to Trump, Trump might either make it difficult for Trinidadians in the United States to remain there, or might stop allowing Trinidadians to go there, might cut the visas. In which case, not only is that bad for those Trinidadian families who rely on the money coming in, but it's bad for Trinidad, which relies on the remittance payments. There's no substitute right now for Trinidad than for its migrants to go to the US, UK, and Canada to send sufficient remittances. So this is a real issue that Kamala Prasad Bisesar has directly said she is worried about, and therefore she has exceeded. So when you talk about carrot and stick, well, one of the carrots and sticks are migrants and the remittance payments. And there's been, I think, inadequate discussion about this in her case. Now, if somebody came along and said, listen, don't worry about it, we'll take care of your external balances, well, that might be a separate issue. But so far, nobody has showed up. She should know that Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico has courageously set this issue aside. I mean, Mexico relies on remittance payments from the United States as well. The one difference is the numbers of Mexicans in the United States so much greater than Trinidadians. For the Trump administration to say all Mexicans must leave would create a serious issue. That's a film, I think, A Day Without Mexicans. What would the United States look like if there were no Mexicans even for one day?
Absolutely. And since you bring up Claudia Scheinbaum's name, maybe you could give us your opinion of her administration. I see her clips show up in my social media, and I love watching her. I mean, she's done so much to uplift the role of women, particularly Indigenous women. She seems like just a ray of light in Latin America, but is that just my outside view wanting to have a ray of light?
Well, firstly, she shows up in my social media feed as well. And I also take great comfort in watching her, partly because she is such a smart and kind person. You know, there's something quite delightful about her personality. She's not aggressive and arrogant and so on. She's extremely humble and extraordinarily intelligent in the way she deals with the public. But that apart, earlier this year, in October, I believe, Tricontinental published a text written by Stephanie Weatherby Brito and Aline Duarte of Morena, which is the political project of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum. The text is about the fourth transformation of Mexico. This is a political vision articulated by Morena, the fourth transformation. The third transformation was in the 1930s, conducted by Lazaro Cardenas, the very extraordinary president of Mexico in the 1930s. This fourth transformation is about recovering Mexico's sovereignty and about, in a sense, advancing Mexico industrially and in terms of infrastructure. So one of the main things you've been seeing probably recently is pictures of Claudia Sheinbaum on a train. Well, part of this is the very important project of building a train system, a high-speed rail system, first in Mexico State, the state of Mexico City, but then outside across the country. I mean, it is ludicrous that a city like Mexico City should not have very good high-speed commuter rail because it's a sprawling city like Los Angeles. I mean, it's ridiculous that Los Angeles doesn't have good high-speed commuter rail that connects the whole city, not just bits of the city, and it's not high speed right now. But it should have high-speed commuter rail across the whole city, including areas where the poor live, and that's part of the fourth transformation project. Another part is to recover and revive whatever social welfare policies there have been and fund it through the taking back of the oil industry from private hands. A very good policy to recover the oil industry, to recover the oil wealth for the sake of the people's welfare and good, to rebuild the education system. I mean, this is a large-scale policy that is trying to take the country in a direction, I wouldn't even say in a left-right axis, but take the country back to the people. Which has been a problem in Mexico. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador once said it's been a problem since the 1930s. I mean, he just invalidated, in a way, 80, 90 years of Mexican history, saying for a very long time, the country has gone to the rich, to the old elites, the latifundistas, the landowners, the big industrialists, people like Carlos Slim and so on. It's time now to take the country back to the people. And in fact, they have the backing of a number of these billionaires who understand a very elementary fact. If you keep going and you give more and more of the country to people like Carlos Slim, the people are going to come and burn you down. They're going to come and destroy whatever wealth you have. They are going to be angry. The wealth inequality is so great that you won't be able to control the anger of people. So you need to balance this out. I think they are doing it in a very clever way, Medea. This is not left and right for them. This is the balance between, why has so much of the share of national wealth gone to advantage the elite? Why can't we move the share of national wealth to advantage the poor, the people, and so on? And I think this is a very positive project, which Claudia Sheinbaum has deepened and continued. I must say that it is not easy to be a woman in government in Mexico, although there are many women in places of high authority. She was just out walking just outside the presidential office and she was groped by a drunk man. I thought she handled it with a lot of dignity, but it demonstrated once again, the kind of deep sense of patriarchy that pervades in these countries, the danger and difficulty for a woman just to go for a walk in daylight. And here's the president of the country. I mean, it tells you that there's a lot of work to be done. We have a lot of struggles ahead of us. I mean, things are not easy. We have a lot of struggles, but I think with people like Claudia Sheinbaum, with Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, with the large project of Moreno, you are seeing this transformation begin in Mexico. It's going to have an impact, and I don't think any threat from Trump will be able to reverse this.
Well, we have a couple of very good questions in the chat I'm going to bring up, and I just want to remind people this is your last chance to put some questions in, and also make sure you sign up to the rapid response of Code Pink. So we'll put that into the chat again. But I think this question is very interesting. How much of the subservience, especially of the Caribbean countries, is the result of insecurity in the face of climate catastrophe?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to say that without first acknowledging that the Caribbean is absolutely vulnerable to the climate disaster. I mean, it produces together, the Caribbean countries in CARICOM, the Caribbean community countries produce less than 1% of global carbon emissions. One has to first say that the responsibility for the climate catastrophe is almost null. And when these hurricanes come, when Maria came and hit Dominica in 2017, when Dorian hit Bahamas in 2019, the destruction was such that with the case of Dorian, 200% of the Bahamas GDP, of the Bahamian GDP, was just absolutely taken off the table. I mean, the seawater rise, it's not a problem of loss of land alone. It's a problem of loss of fresh water because seawater is intruding into the water table. These countries don't have the water for drinking in some cases, very much under threat. The bleaching of coral. I mean, the level of the catastrophe is quite high. And I mean, what can these countries do? Well, interesting. The Prime Minister of Barbados, who is a very forthright advocate for her people, has been leading the call to revive the question of reparations. They're talking about reparations for enslavement. But, let's just say loss and damage for the climate catastrophe reparations. But so, I mean, I would like to say that, I mean, you on the one side are thinking of people like Kamala Prasad Basesar, who has been extraordinarily subservient to the Trump administration. On the other side, you have Mia Mottley of Barbados, who's the one calling for reparations. You have Mia Mottley standing up to the whole West. So I don't think you can read one-on-one that the climate catastrophe is creating subservience, because you're having some people, Kamala Prasad Basesar here, completely subservient to the US, mostly, I think, not on the climate issue, but on reparation, on remittances and migrants. And you have Mia Motley sitting here just saying, where's the money, fellas? I mean, it's all very well to come to the cops and say, we are this, that, and the other. You have a loss and damage fund. Why don't you fund it? You have a climate fund. Why aren't you funding it? Maybe we should demand reparations again. And I'm going to say that our comrade and friend Kwesi Pratt Jr. of the Socialist Movement of Ghana has written a book on reparations. The book was recently on billboards in Angola. People were promoting the idea of reparations. I'm very happy to see that. And the president of Ghana, John Manama, is going to take Kwesi's book and the idea of reparations to the African Union. There's going to be a serious debate and discussion about this. I mean, we haven't given up yet, right? That's the point. We haven't given up yet. This subservience you are seeing from Kamla Prasad Basesar here or from somebody else there, this doesn't define the tide. The tide keeps moving and shifting. There may be an angry tide now. And by the way, I did like the term pink tide, and I know why you liked it. You have this special affinity for the idea of pink. The pink tide was definitely better than the angry tide. But other tides might appear. There should never be a sense of futility and hopelessness. History is much too complicated. If we start feeling hopeless, then we will not participate in making the next kind of tide. Our hopelessness is resignation. We have to be in the fight. We have to be engaged in it. We have to be behind people like Mia Motley on reparations. We have to be behind Nicolas Maduro saying, don't intervene, more peace, not war, that ridiculous dance. War. Yeah, no war, etc. I mean, that's where we have to be. If we feel hopeless, that would be really depressing.
Well, we've got just a couple of minutes left. I wanted to give a shout out since we were talking about climate disasters in the Hurricane Melissa that recently hit Jamaica and Haiti and Cuba, and many hurricanes before that. It is remarkable that in the case of Cuba, there's almost never people that die in those because Cuba is so organized as a government to evacuate people, to deal with these climate disasters. But of course, they all do need reparations, as you say, from the countries that are responsible for the climate chaos. So as we wrap up, there was a question here about should the UN do something more to try to stop the US intervention in Venezuela? And I think I want to put that in the larger context of are there any global bodies that are able to step in? We're feeling so desperate right now to want to say, wait, stop this. It can't happen. We won't let it happen in our watch, on our lifetimes. Is there some international body that we can be pressuring to do something?
Yeah, I mean, look, frankly, the UN is a very complicated instrument. I always feel that people should not attack the UN because the UN plays such an important and vital role in the agencies. I mean, without the UNICEF, without UNHCR, without the UN Palestinian Agency, imagine the situation in Gaza now. I mean, it would be outrageous. We could not imagine what the situation would be without the agency function. But the UN Security Council is trapped by global politics. I mean, it literally cannot move an agenda at all, at this time. And right now, even if a country puts a resolution, and I wish that the other permanent members, the Russians, the Chinese, and others would put resolutions in there, daring the United States to veto them, because that's part of the struggle. Put a resolution in saying, the United Nations Security Council resolution says to de-escalate in Venezuela because it's too dangerous for the whole Caribbean. I mean, interestingly, one of the members on the current Security Council, the non-permanent members, is Guyana, which has had its own struggles with Venezuela over the Essequibo region, but is not interested in a war because that'll impact Guyana. It's a small country. It would be interesting if Guyana put in something at the Security Council, members' resolution. I don't see why we don't see a country like even whatever. I mean, I'm just playing games now. I mean, Pakistan is sitting there. Put in a resolution.
Algeria.
Yeah, put in a resolution, my friends. Exactly. Algeria, has a role in the non-aligned movement. Maybe it should put it. I mean, there is no global. I'm sorry to say, there is no global body that is capable right now of coming in and preventing the United States, and has not been capable of preventing the United States from an attack since at least 1989, when the US went in and attacked Panama and brought out Manuel Noriega, former CIA asset, and threw him in a prison cell in Florida. I mean, the United States has behaved atrociously in Latin America for several hundred years. I mean, Operation Brother Sam against Brazil in 1964, which helped along the coup that lasted for 21 years, the intervention in Chile. I mean, we don't even need to go over the record. It's familiar to everybody. It has behaved appallingly. Nobody has been able to stop the United States. The only country that has actually been able to really stop the United States is Cuba. 11 million people, 90 miles off the coast of the United States, defeated the United States at the Bay of Pigs, prevented the assassination of Fidel Castro 600 some times. I mean, the extraordinary Cuban Revolution. I always tell people, United States has nothing against Cuba. It has nothing against Cuba, but it has a lot against the Cuban Revolution. It's the Cuban Revolution that they want to overthrow. It's not Cuba. It's not a personal thing. These fellas, Marco Rubio and so on, quite happy to go back to Cuba and recover their lost lands, take back the big estates, and rebuild the casinos and so on. They have a problem with the Cuban Revolution, and salutes to the Cuban Revolution for withstanding the pressure since 1959. And in fact, defeating the United States. It's not a big global institution. That was your question. I've come back down to this tiny island, the small island that doesn't say no, that says I can do it, like that little train, I can do it.
Well, that's a good note for us to end on. Well, one thing we should recognize that the Organization of American States has been hopeless and really run by the United States, so we can't look at that. But on this idea of Cuba, we did come up with the flotilla idea. So I'd like to leave us on a high note of saying, let's get those boats going from both Florida and from Mexico. And then you keep working on this idea of Asia and get the Chinese to come in with some real boats and real aid. But this has been great, Vijay. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for giving us such a comprehensive view of what's going on in the region. And with all the sadness that we see with the economic blockades and this seizing of tankers and all of that, you managed to somehow keep a smile on your face and leave us inspired to stop our government from running roughshod over the people of Latin America.
Thanks a lot, Medea. It's so great always to be with you. You and I come from the tradition of keep hope alive. And we keep hope alive not by hoping, but by doing. And that's Code Pink's mantra, always do. I loved seeing you always disrupt people in Congress. And I was so happy to see you even find unlikely allies on this or that issue. People don't understand how important it is to widen our alliances. And whether it's a former nutcase that one has to embrace, well, on this or that issue, we build tactical alliances. So bravo to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Good night. And good night to everybody who's been watching us.
Bye. Thanks a lot.